The Holy Shroud is one of Christianity's most sacred relics. On the rare occasions it has been displayed, millions of followers have come to venerate it.
We're really lucky to be able to see a trace of Jesus.
The shape of a man's body on a piece of fabric like this strengthens my belief.
An object of devotion for millions of Catholics, the Shroud of Turin is believed to have draped the body of Christ after his crucifixion, making it nearly 2,000 years old, and the ultimate proof of his existence and resurrection.
I don't think we can ignore the huge amount of evidence there is. In my opinion, it's definitely authentic.
Popes John Paul II, Francis, and Benedict XVI have visited the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, where the Holy Shroud is kept, to pray and pay homage to it.
Invochiamo la sua infinita templare il suo volto glorioso.
Recent popes have walked a very fine line. Pope John Paul II said it was a mirror of the gospel. He neither said it was authentic nor that it was a fake.
Many historians and scientists question the shroud's authenticity, believing the relic was created by an artist in the Middle Ages.
It's obvious, based on the style, that the shroud dates back to the mid-14th century. I think it's a painting.
Radiocarbon dating in 1988 seems to confirm this theory.
When they said it was from the first 25 to 50 years of the 14th century, we admitted it was plausible.
The Catholic Church validated the findings, yet the issue remains a matter of debate even today.
That virtually ignored all the scientific data that showed the shroud had to be older than that.
But recently, another study aimed to prove that the radiocarbon dating was incorrect and that the shroud is actually much older.
Our study of the shroud found that it's an authentic relic some 2,000 years old.
So how old is the Shroud of Turin really? Does it date back to 33 AD, after the death and resurrection of Christ? Or to the 13th or even 14th century, as many experts claim? Leading scientific and historical authorities will attempt to lift the veil of mystery surrounding this strange, unique object, a controversial relic that both divides and joins so many. This is Salamanca, Spain, 200 kilometers northwest of Madrid. On this day in November 2022, a crowd of curious people gathered to see a much talked about exhibition called The Mystery Man. And this is what it looked like. It was a very realistic reproduction of the crucified body of Jesus Christ.
It's as if he were really there. When I look at it, I'm fascinated. I didn't expect to be so moved.
This hyper-realistic replica of the body of Christ was created under the supervision of Álvaro Blanco, the curator of the exhibition.
It's like seeing Jesus' face and body for the first time. It humanizes Christ as he appears on the shroud.
To create this incredible statue made of silicone and latex, the sculptures took inspiration from a model known around the world, the Holy Shroud. To see the original, you must travel to Italy to the city of Turin, the capital of Piedmont. The ancient relic is housed here, in the heart of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, but is rarely displayed for public viewing. Bruno Barberis, who works for the Museum of the Shroud, is one of the few people who have gotten the chance to see it up close.
The shroud is kept inside this glass case in order to maintain the ideal conditions for conservation, which is to say a temperature of 20 degrees Celsius, a relative humidity of 50%, and air that contains argon, an inert gas that prevents the oxidation caused by oxygen in the atmosphere.
The Diocese of Turin considers the shroud to be a national treasure, and as such, it must be protected at any cost. It's a very old, highly fragile object that has been the victim of the ravages of time. So much so that today, it's hard to figure out what one is looking at with the naked eye.
When you look at the shroud with the naked eye, you don't see much. The linen itself is cream in color, and the imprint is light red, so there isn't much contrast. The details aren't very clear.
You can just about see some slight yellowish-brown imprints on the piece of fabric, but they aren't very apparent, at least not anymore. What's more obvious, however, are some very obvious bright red marks, which are supposed to be bloodstains.
In the chapel of the Museum of the Shroud in Turin, if you looked at this exact replica of the relic from 3 or 4 meters away, you can make out a few important details that appear on the shroud.
You can see the whole length of it from back here, and one thing that jumps out right away is that it's divided into 2 parts. On the left, you have the imprint of the front, and on the right, the imprint of the back. Many researchers have tried to calculate the height of the man who was wrapped inside this sheet, and they've come up with anything from a minimum of 1.68 to a maximum of 1.82 meters.
The reason people have attempted to calculate the man's height is because they're convinced that this 4.4-meter-long sheet is actually a burial shroud that was once wrapped around the body of Jesus Christ, which would explain its size and the fact that the image appears on both the front and back.
It shows the front and back of a dead man who was whipped, tortured, and crucified, with all the signs of the Passion of Christ, the crown of thorns, and the spear wound on the right side. So it's like seeing the body of Jesus himself after he died.
The idea that the Shroud of Turin might bear the imprint of the actual body of Christ is at the heart of an international controversy between those who believe it's authentic and those who think it's a fake that was created in the Middle Ages. This controversy began in the late 19th century, in 1898 to be exact.
In Turin, there was a sort of World's Fair where people from all over Italy presented new technical innovations. The church in Turin decided to make an exception by putting the Shroud of Turin on display. It was hugely successful. Tens of thousands of Catholics came to see it, and the Archbishop of Turin gave special permission to an amateur photographer, Secondo Pia, to take pictures of the holy object.
He locked himself inside the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. The relic was laid out on a table, and the photographer set up all his equipment. Then he went home with his photographic plates. He turned on the dim red light and put the first plate into the tray of developer, then removed it a few minutes later. He was astonished. He said that he actually started to tremble and almost dropped the plate. That's how amazed he was by what he saw.
The negative of the Holy Shroud that Secondo Pia was holding in his hands showed an image that was much more visible than when looking at the relic with the naked eye. The image showed a man that was a perfect match for traditional representations of Jesus Christ.
That first photograph was really a surprise, because he realized that in the negative of the photographic image, the face and body that can barely be seen on the shroud itself were suddenly much more apparent.
He was shocked by what he saw, and he quickly shared his findings. It caused a lot of excitement, and people started getting more interested in the relic. They said it was miraculous that something that was almost invisible to the naked eye became visible when it was photographed, and that it was proof of a miracle.
But while some people saw it as a miracle and suggested the relic might be authentic, others saw it as a scandal and even accused Secondo Pia of modifying the image.
There were columns in photography magazines debating the image and trying to explain how the flash could have printed a sort of proto-photograph on the object due to the strength of the light. In Catholic spheres, there was talk of whether it might be supernatural, whether it might be the portrait of Christ himself, while others said there was nothing supernatural about it at all.
The Shroud of Turin, an object unlike any other, stirred up strong feelings. People from both camps set forth their arguments. There were theories based on science, history, and the Bible itself. Those who believed in the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin said the image was the imprint left by the body of Jesus when he was wrapped in it after his death 2,000 years ago. In an attempt to prove the object's authenticity, they began searching the 4 Gospels of the New Testament for proof.
If we compare the characteristics that we see in the imprint on the Holy Shroud and what the Gospels say about the torture, crucifixion, death, and burial of Jesus, we see that there are many important parallels. In chapter 20 of the Gospel of John, Simon Peter and John the Evangelist go to the tomb early in the morning. On the stone bench inside the tomb, they find the burial shroud lying over to the side, as if the body had vanished from inside it.
This interpretation is disputed by many historians. They say the Gospels never even mention the existence of a sheet of this size, let alone an imprint on the fabric itself.
If the Gospels are a reliable account of Jesus' death, the Shroud of Turin can't be the one mentioned in the Gospels.
The Gospel of John makes a distinction between his head, which was covered with a shroud, the piece of fabric that was used to mop sweat from his brow, and the rest of his body, which was covered with multiple pieces of material. The Gospel of John clearly states that at the moment of his resurrection, both the strips of cloth and the larger pieces of material that had been wrapped around the body were thrown into a pile, but that the piece that had been wound around his head was folded and set aside.
These accounts, which contain very few details and sometimes contradict one another, cannot be considered proof of the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin, if the Bible can even be considered as a historical source.
The main issue with the Gospels is their questionable historical accuracy. We know we can't treat the Gospels as precise historical accounts of what happened.
If you want to say it's all historical and that the shroud was in the tomb with an imprint of Christ's face on it all along, why isn't that mentioned in the Gospels? That's the first problem. It seems very unlikely that a piece of fabric so miraculous in nature wouldn't have been mentioned by the evangelists.
Despite the lack of concrete proof of the existence of the Holy Shroud before the Middle Ages, those who believe in its authenticity have been trying for years to trace the history of the relic between the year 33 AD, when Jesus died, and 1578, when it arrived in Turin. In his book, The Holy Shroud of Turin, Witness to the Passion of Jesus Christ, historian Jean-Christian Petit-Fils makes his best attempt at this delicate historical task.
To me, there's a gap after the year 33, when Simon Peter and John the Evangelist found the winding sheet lying flat on the stone bench, which is the actual place where Jesus' body was laid. We know that for sure. There are all sorts of stories, but all we know is that in the year 404 or 405, a certain Daniel Le Bonheureux went to Edessa where he saw something extraordinary.
Jean-Christian Petit-Fils believes that the Holy Shroud of Turin corresponds to a very old object known as the Mandelion, an image of Christ that was conserved in Edessa, an ancient city that was part of the Byzantine Empire at the time. In the 4th century AD, this eastern portion of the Roman Empire, whose capital was Constantinople, now known as Istanbul in Turkey, became a stronghold of the relatively new religion of Christianity. Cities such as Nicaea and Antioch were home to the first Christian communities.
It's a hypothesis of mine. In 387, at a time when there was a lot of trouble in Antioch, a large portion of the aristocracy in Antioch went to Edessa. There were Christians there who brought this precious treasure. That's when Edessa came into possession of this icon of non-human origin. That's when the story of the burial shroud really began.
So might the Mandylion and the Holy Shroud actually be the same thing? Once again, the hypothesis doesn't quite seem to line up with what the historic documents say about the relic of Edessa.
We have accounts of the Mandylion of Edessa starting in the 6th century. A king of Edessa, Abgar, who was probably mythological, was supposed to have lived during the time of Christ. Supposedly, he sent a messenger to Jesus, asking him to cure him, and Jesus sent him one of his apostles, Thaddeus, with a letter that cured King Abgar.
That letter became a letter on which a painting of the face of Jesus Christ appeared. Jesus is said to have used a towel to wash his face, and afterwards his facial features were miraculously imprinted on the towel. But the mandolin of Edessa is a simple piece of fabric showing an image of Jesus alive and with his eyes open. It's not an image of the whole body like we have on the shroud, just his face.
Despite the inconsistencies in this theory about the Mandylion of Edessa, Jean-Christian Petit-Fils' book claims there's proof of the presence of the Holy Shroud before the 14th century, when its existence was officially confirmed by historians. According to him, it was kept in Constantinople and even reproduced in a 12th century manuscript, the Prey Codex.
There's a codex kept in the Municipal Library of Budapest that shows different miniatures. In one or two of the miniatures, you see a man with his arms crossed, naked, in the same position as the man on the burial shroud. And you can see the chevrons, the little holes that appear on the shroud. If we put all of that together, there are 7 or 8 points of correspondence between the mandolin and the Shroud of Turin. The Prey Codex is a Hungarian manuscript that shows the washing of the body of Christ and the moment when his empty tomb was discovered. Defenders of the shroud's authenticity point out that in the miniature of the empty tomb, there is a large parallelepiped with small circles bearing a certain resemblance to the burn holes on the shroud. That parallelepiped is the stone of the sepulchre, not the shroud itself. The shroud is rolled up in a corner without any imprint on it. So to be using this image as absolute proof means you've got nothing else, because there's practically nothing in the image.
Despite the lack of proof or reliable historical sources, those who believe the Holy Shroud is authentic have come up with numerous theories about the path traveled by the relic over the course of the first 1,000 years AD. One theory is that it was kept in the Church of the Virgin of the Pharos, a Byzantine chapel built in the southern portion of the Grand Palace in Constantinople, which was home to numerous relics of Christ, such as the crown of thorns. Then it's said to have been stolen by French knights during the Fourth Crusade in 1204.
They believe the shroud that's located in Turin today is the authentic shroud. So they're always looking for proof, all kinds of clues, some of which are more convincing than others, to link the final point of their argument to the Gospels.
They take details that are really tiny, even cryptic, and line them up all next to one another to form a sort of chain between the year 30 AD and the 14th century. It doesn't really matter if the links of the chain are in Constantinople, Edessa, or somewhere else entirely. Any theory goes, as long as they can say the shroud is somewhere.
In reality, the first authenticated documents attesting to the existence of the Holy Shroud date back to the 14th century. It's here in the departmental archives of the Aubes, located in the city of Troyes, that we find the oldest of these manuscripts, a document called a bull, which was written by the Pope at the time.
It's a bull that was issued by the Pope of Avignon in the summer of 1390. The Pope of Avignon was Clement VII. You can see his name here, Clement. Servus servum Dei, servant of the servants of God. It's very interesting and important because it explains very clearly the status of the object at the time. In the statement, the Pope says that they had the right to display the object for veneration, not as a relic, but as a so-called representation of the shroud, so as not to deceive the faithful about its true nature.
The origin of this papal decision was a controversial conflict between Pierre d'Arcis, the bishop of the city of Troyes, and the family of Knight Geoffrey de Charny, the first official owner of the shroud in the mid-14th century. It all started around the year 1354 in the small commune of Lirey in Champagne, some 15 kilometers away from Troyes. This is where the knight had a small chapel built, the Collégiale de Lirey, to display the shroud.
The story of the Shroud of Turin begins here, because this is where we have historical evidence of the presence of the Holy Shroud on this piece of land in Lirey. This is the Chapel of the Annunciation, which was built in the mid-19th century on the site of a much larger church that was here in the past. The Holy Shroud was housed here, just a few meters away, somewhere inside the primitive chapel that was built before Geoffroy de Charny's death. The Shroud of Turin remained here for around 15 years. Lirey became a major pilgrimage site.
The popularity of this site eventually caught the attention of the Bishop of Troyes.
In the late 15th century, the Bishop of Troyes, Pierre d'Arcis, wrote to the Pope saying it was a counterfeit, a fake. He claimed it had been fabricated just to bring in money, and that his predecessor, the last Bishop of Troyes, had already investigated it in the past, and even found the counterfeiter, who explained how and why he had created it.
The reason the Bishop of Troyes was so hostile to the shroud in Lirey is because at the time in the Middle Ages, there were so-called holy shrouds all over Europe.
There were all sorts of pieces of fabric that were supposed to have been in contact with the body of Christ. So in the Middle Ages, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then 10, 20, 30 burial shrouds or winding sheets all over Europe.
We have to get rid of the modern idea that what we're dealing with might have been a singular, exceptional object. In the Middle Ages, there were around 130 sanctuaries that claimed to have the one true shroud, or at least a piece of it.
In medieval France, some shrouds, such as those located in Besançon, Compiègne, Carcassonne, and Cadouin in Périgord, were very important objects of worship, yet all of them were eventually revealed to be fakes. So could the Shroud of Turin be just another medieval painting? Those who believe in its authenticity are convinced it's more than that. They even claim that it was this icon of non-human origin that the medieval artists used as their model.
There's one major problem in the shroud's iconography for defenders of its authenticity, which is that the iconography clearly corresponds to how Christ was depicted in the 14th century. It's a precise match for canonical representations of Christ in the mid-14th century.
Because contrary to common belief, representations of Jesus have not always resembled those found in the image on the Holy Shroud.
We have a very European idea of Christ today, with a center part, light brown hair, blue eyes, and sometimes a small beard. But earlier depictions reflected the codes of Greco-Roman iconography. They were from the Greco-Roman world.
There are all kinds of Christs. There's a young Christ and a more cynical, philosophical Christ with a large beard. There was a version of Christ who looked like Jupiter in the 4th century.
There are depictions of him as a good shepherd with a sheep on his head, where he's clean-shaven and has short hair. You wouldn't guess it was Jesus when you look at it.
Yet despite the arguments put forth by the art history experts, those who believe in the authenticity of the Holy Shroud maintain that the image on the winding sheet couldn't have been simply painted on the fabric.
Today, the biggest problem for people who want to prove it's fake is the technique used to print the face and body on the winding sheet. We're not entirely sure how it could have been done. If it is a fake from the 14th century, we don't know how they did it.
Reproducing the Shroud of Turin using techniques that existed in the Middle Ages, such is the challenge taken on by Luigi Garlaschelli, a former chemistry professor at the University of Padua in Italy.
First, we did a test using an actual person. We covered their body in red paint and put them under a sheet to see what kind of imprint the human body would leave. The result was this horrible, deformed image. So I concluded that the image on the Shroud of Turin definitely couldn't have been created from an imprint of an actual human body.
Faced with such unconvincing results, Luigi considered a different possibility consisting of a sculpting technique called bas relief, which already existed in the Middle Ages.
It's very likely that they used a bas-relief. This is a plaster bas-relief that I made myself. I'm going to cover this bas-relief with a piece of fabric. Then for the face, as well as the rest of the body, I'm going to apply a reddish ochre pigment using this stamp.
Luigi spends around 10 minutes lightly stamping the entirety of this piece of linen fabric, the same material as the Shroud of Turin. The various parts of this bas relief gradually start to appear.
Next, I'll heat the fabric in an oven to eliminate any traces of the pigment.
By using this technique on the bas relief of a whole body, Luigi obtains this fairly realistic human form, which he then puts in an oven at 125 degrees Celsius for 4 hours. The result is surprising.
This produces an image that is much softer and still a bit blurry. Next, I'll add the bloodstains using the same technique. Here you can see the combustion holes caused by the 1532 fire. We also added the marks that were left by water, probably used to put out the fire.
The fire of 1532 took place when the Holy Shroud was located in the city of Chambéry, where its new owners, the Dukes of Savoy, had kept it safe in the chapel of their palace for decades.
At the time, the shroud was being kept in an alcove behind the altar in the church of Chambéry. It was folded up and stored inside a metallic box. The heat of the fire caused the metal box to melt, and several drops of molten metal dripped onto the corners of the fabric, causing these perforations.
That's why when you unfold it and look at it today, you can see burn marks and even small holes at regular intervals. You can see for yourself that if you fold it up, the holes are all aligned.
After being seriously damaged by the fire, the Shroud of Turin was entrusted to the Poor Clares, an order of Franciscan nuns who gave it a new lease on life. They spent nearly a year patiently creating a lining out of the Dutch taffeta to reinforce the relic, then patching the 24 holes placed symmetrically all across the shroud. A few decades later, in 1578, Emmanuel Philibert, the Duke of Savoy, decided to transfer the precious relic to the city of Turin.
The shroud traveled from Chambéry to Turin when the Savoy family moved its capital there. At first, it was displayed as it had been before. Each year, there was a procession. Over the next few hundred years, we can observe that it was put on display less and less often.
The Shroud of Turin, which had until now been quite discreet, was to become the most famous holy object in the world, starting in the early 20th century, thanks to Secondo Pia's photograph. Defenders of the authenticity of the shroud point to the photographic negative as proof that the object is far more than just a painting or a drawing. It's a miracle. The miracle of an imprint left by Jesus' body after his death, when he was wrapped inside this sheet 2,000 years ago.
Yves Delage, a scientist and member of the Academy of Sciences, said himself what we can all see for ourselves. The man from the burial shroud was crucified and is a perfect match for Jesus of Nazareth as he was described in the Gospels. The vapography theory put forth by Delage is that the image was produced by emissions of aloe mixed with sweat. There are also other theories that other people have come up with, such as Professor Barbet, who suggested it was an herbarium effect in which the image was printed indelibly on the fabric.
Yves Delage, Pierre Barbet, and Paul Vignon, all three scientists were fascinated by the mystery of how this image was imprinted on the fabric. In their efforts to find an explanation, they even invented a new scientific discipline, syndenology.
The word syndenology comes from the Greek word syndon, which is borrowed from Semitic languages and originally referred to fabrics such as linen, which can be translated into English as winding sheet. So in a way, it's the study of burial shrouds.
Syndenologists generally believe the shroud is authentic, and the purpose of their field of science is to prove its authenticity. They also use history and art history to try to find very, very old sources that might help prove the existence of the shroud, as well as anatomy and even surgery, as they perform something akin to an autopsy on the fabric. They take blood samples, DNA, pollen, and all sorts of things into consideration.
Thanks to the creation of syndenology, this relic has become the subject of a whole new kind of scientific study. In the 1970s, a collective known as STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, pulled out all the stops in their attempt to solve the mystery of the Holy Shroud. In 1977, Don Devon, a 3D imaging specialist, got in touch with photographer Barry Schwartz, who now lives in the mountains of Colorado, to ask him to join the team.
I said no, because I felt maybe a bit uncomfortable getting involved in something that was of a religious nature that I had no knowledge of or no expertise in. I mean, he said, look, forget that. This is about science. This is not about religion. What matters is your skill and your technical abilities as a technical photographer.
In total, it was a team of some 30 men and women, optical engineers, biochemists, and coroners who took off for Italy in September 1978. It was the 400th anniversary of the Holy Shroud's arrival in Turin, and the relic had been taken out of its box to be displayed for tens of thousands of Catholics who had traveled from all over the world to see it. After the exhibition, the collective of researchers got to work.
They were given permission to spend 5 days examining the shroud in the vestry of the Church of St. John the Baptist in Turin. They laid the shroud out flat and took pictures of it using infrared fluorescence. They brought 6 tons of equipment with them and put tens of thousands of hours of work into their analysis.
In an attempt to determine how the image was formed on the shroud, John P. Jackson and Eric Jumper, 2 U.S. Air Force engineers, used a high-tech machine known as a VP8 image analyzer.
The television signal is processed by a VP8 image analyzer, which has the ability to translate the image patterns as adjustable levels of vertical relief on this monitor.
Jumper and Jackson compared the image obtained with this device, which was used by NASA to map the terrain of the moon, with a traditional 2D photograph.
Now, John is adjusting the gain. I'm sure you'll agree that even my mother would have trouble recognizing me there. Now, the reason for this is very simple. A normal photograph records only variations in light and does not record information about the distance the camera was from the subject. Now we'll put a picture of the shroud under the camera.
There's depth information encoded into the density of the image. That's why the VP8 image analyzer revealed the natural relief of a human form.
Based on this observation, John P. Jackson came up with a very controversial theory that the image could have been formed by the radiation emitted from Jesus Christ's body at the moment of his resurrection.
There was this idea that the image could have been formed by an orthogonal projection coming from the body, and that the body might have mysteriously projected the image onto the fabric. Jackson suggested that the shroud could have sort of scanned Jesus' body as it was wrapped inside it, if you believe in the resurrection. Obviously, it was rays that generated the imprint. They must have been emitted by the human body. That would imply a supernatural event such as the resurrection of a human body, which has no basis in science.
The team of researchers also had another goal, which was to determine whether the shroud might contain traces of pigments that would indicate it might be a painting, or traces of blood that would give credence to the theory that the shroud had actually been wrapped around a wounded human body. The syndenologists all agreed on this point.
As soon as the shroud was laid out before us, I immediately pulled out my 10x magnifier and I went to the image areas of the shroud and I started looking to see if I could see any paint or any pigment. And I immediately saw there was nothing, that whatever this was, there was no paint or pigment that made that image.
They collected all the information they could in an attempt to understand what the so-called blood stains were actually made of and what had caused the imprint of a body on the fabric. They were able to prove beyond any doubt that the red stains were indeed traces of human blood that acted like they were from the AB group.
The problem was that one member of the team didn't reach the same conclusions as his colleagues. His name was Walter Macron, and he was an American scientist specialized in microanalysis and organic chemistry. During an interview with a French television station in 1993, he shared his findings.
J'ai utilisé un microscope optique pour examiner les constituants de l'image. Et j'ai découvert qu'il y avait de petites particules, de toutes petites particules rouges qui ressemblaient à des pigments colorés. Les pigments sont les seuls constituants de l'image et il n'y en a que sur l'image. On n'en a trouvé sur aucune autre partie du sphère. Ça ne peut pas être autre chose qu'une œuvre d'artiste.
Using a highly refined electronic microscope that allowed him to enlarge a particle taken from the shroud by a factor of 6,200, Macron discovered that it contained iron, sulfur, and most importantly, mercury, a poison that was not found in actual blood.
When he announced his results, declaring that there were traces of pigment on the shroud and that the blood was dye, not blood, he was kicked off the STURP team and forced to give back the samples he had used in his analyses.
Embarrassed by the controversy ignited by the STURP's team's research, the Vatican and the Diocese of Turin, who officially took over ownership of the Shroud of Turin in 1983, made a decision that would change things forever.
Over the course of STURP's analysis of the shroud, one option they considered was a new analytical technique called radiocarbon dating.
The community of the Archdiocese of Turin was fairly confident that the radiocarbon dating would prove the shroud's authenticity once and for all.
Luigi Gonella, who was the scientific advisor to the Archbishop of Turin at the time, got in touch with Jacques Evon, one of the world's leading experts on radiocarbon dating.
I was attending an international radiocarbon dating conference, and this Italian man I didn't know sat down next to me, introduced himself, and explained that he was a delegate sent by the Cardinal of Turin to discuss the possibility of using radiocarbon dating on the shroud.
Carbon dating, a technique that was perfected in the 1950s by American Willard Libby, consists of burning small pieces of organic material to measure the amount of carbon they contain. This method paved the way for substantial progress in the field of archaeology.
It's used to analyze organic tissue from plants and animals. Our bodies are made primarily of carbon, and there's one carbon isotope in particular that degrades at a known speed, a known rate, and starts degrading after death. Radiocarbon dating consists of comparing the amount of C14 that the sample contained when it was alive with what we know about C14 levels in the past. It's a simple mathematical calculation. If you take a water bottle and drill a hole in it, it leaks at a known speed. So if you walk into a room and see that bottle is 2/3 empty, you can use a simple calculation to determine how long ago the hole was drilled.
For the Vatican and the Diocese of Turin, the stakes were equal to the relic's importance, very high. In order to complete the carbon dating process, they would need to take a sample of the linen on the Holy Shroud, which meant cutting into it, a destructive method.
There was no way this method could be used on an object as unique as the shroud. Over time, of course, the process was refined, and it became possible to do radiocarbon dating using microscopic samples rather than macroscopic.
On April 21st, 1988, Professor Giovanni Rigi di Numana was chosen to perform the extraordinary delicate operation of taking a sample from the Shroud of Turin under the watchful eyes of Luigi Gunella and Dr. Michael Tite from the British Museum. Once this step had been completed, the sample of the holy relic was ready to be analyzed.
Given the circumstances, we wanted to put a number of safeguards in place. One of them was to use 3 different labs instead of the usual one, and to choose those labs very carefully. In addition, we also decided to analyze other samples that dated back to the time periods the shroud might have originated in.
The heavy responsibility of conducting the radiocarbon dating analysis was entrusted to 3 carefully selected labs in Zurich, Oxford, and Tucson. It was a meticulous, multi-step process. Christine Oberlin, director of the Archaeology and Archaeometry Lab at Lyon 1 University, explains how it works.
Whenever a new sample arrives at the lab, the first step is to clean it. Basically, we want to remove anything that isn't carbon from the sample. So it's a really crucial step. I have here a sample of linen that's rather dirty, so we're going to treat it chemically with acid and lye to make it very clean.
It takes an average of 2 days to clean a sample of linen like this one, which is similar in size to the sample taken from the Shroud of Turin in 1988.
Once the sample is clean, we remove the amount we need to make a measurement, which is around 2 milligrams.
After the linen thread is extracted, it's weighed on this scale to ensure it doesn't exceed the weight of 2 milligrams.
Now I put it inside this ring made out of tin, which will then be rolled into a ball so we can insert it into the elemental analyzer that will burn the sample.
After being inserted into one of the holes on this particular object, called a tablet container, the sample is placed inside the elemental analyzer, a device that uses high oxygen environment to burn natural elements such as animals, minerals, and plants. Next, the carbon dioxide, or CO2, resulting from the combustion of the linen, is carried through a tube into this blue compartment containing liquid nitrogen.
The CO2 is trapped inside the liquid nitrogen, which transforms the carbon dioxide into a solid that we can then capture and seal into a bulb to send it off to be measured.
Once the sample is trapped inside this bulb, it's sent to another lab for the final step in the dating process. It all happens inside this gigantic machine known as the particle accelerator, or spectrometer. It measures the number of carbon-14 atoms present in a given sample by detecting the specific atoms based on their atomic mass. After several months of work, this technique, which was revolutionary at the time, finally produced a verdict on October 13, 1988.
Many people already had their suspicions, but millions of Catholics were still venerating it. The verdict was finally announced. The Shroud of Turin is a fake. The announcement was made by the Archbishop and Cardinal of Turin himself after all three labs obtained the same result.
Nel rimettere alla scienza la valutazione di questi risultati, la Chiesa ribadisce il suo rispetto e la sua venerazione per questa veneranda icona di Cristo.
The announcement of the results of the carbon dating analysis was like a bombshell. The people who had initiated the process were convinced it would prove the shroud's authenticity, but it did the opposite. The results were undeniable. In the end, it turned out that the Shroud of Turin was nothing more than another counterfeit medieval relic.
When they announced it was a fake, it was a big blow. 1260, 1390, with a big exclamation point on the blackboard.
They used a blackboard and put the dates, 1260, 1390, with an exclamation point after it, sort of almost like a joke, even though it's a very serious subject. And the headlines were, "Shroud is a fake."
Once the results had been proclaimed by multiple well-known scientific laboratories using a proven technique, then validated by the Catholic Church itself in 1988, the debate seemed to be over, at least on paper. Yet the defenders of the authenticity of the shroud didn't take long to mount a counterattack.
There was a discrepancy in the laboratory results that was never explained. The lab in Oxford obtained a much earlier date, whereas the labs in Tucson and Zurich found a much later one. Oxford said 1260, whereas Zurich said 1340 or 1350. So that obviously raised a lot of questions. The possibility of biological or chemical pollution on the fabric was also considered, especially because of the shroud's history. For example, it's entirely possible that the chemical structure of the fabric might have been altered during the devastating fire of 1532, which could have had some sort of impact on the results of the carbon dating.
Instead of putting an end to the controversy as the Church had originally hoped, the results of the radiocarbon dating merely added fuel to the fire.
There were people saying the sample might have been taken from a section that had been repaired in some way. That's absurd. The people who took the sample would have had to be idiots to do that. We have to trust the professionals who carried out the analysis, who have always shown themselves to be competent throughout their lifetimes and their professional careers. I know what I'm talking about because I'm the one who advised Luigi Gonella to bring in a fabric expert named Gabriel Vial, who is the director of the Musée des Tissus. So what am I supposed to say in response to such an absurd accusation? I have nothing to say to them.
The announcement of the radiocarbon dating results caused quite the uproar. Lots of people contested them, and the context was favorable to a sort of radicalization, if you will, a certain discourse surrounding the shroud that tended in favor of its authenticity. They were determined to uphold at any cost the idea that the syndenologist had not been mistaken, but that it was the carbon dating process itself that was wrong.
In the late 1980s, a number of organizations were created, such as the CIELT, the International Center for the Study of the Shroud of Turin, which was founded in 1989. They had a single goal: to prove the authenticity of the shroud by any means possible.
They tried everything they could to refute the results of the carbon dating process. For example, they supported the pollen theory, which was supported by Max Frey, a Swiss criminologist. It suggested that the shroud contained traces of pollen from the region of the Holy Land dating back to the time of Christ.
After that scientist published his theory, I showed it to some French palynologist colleagues of mine. They jumped out of their seats. They said it was unbelievable nonsense, because pollens are identified by species or by genre. A given genre can exist anywhere on the planet, not just in Jerusalem.
The most recent theory was put forth by a team of scientists working for the CNR, the National Research Council in Bari, in southern Italy.
Show me how the sample is constructed, please.
For several years, Professor De Caro and his team at the Crystallography Institute have been working on a new method of dating using X-rays called wax. This still experimental technique consists of studying the thickness of the fibers on a microscopic scale using a sample from the shroud that was taken many years ago.
Linen is composed of textile fibers formed by cellulose, which is a polymer, which is to say, a repetition of the same molecule many times over. The length of this polymer depends on its age. So it's possible to estimate the age of a given piece of fabric once we've calibrated the measurements.
This graph shows curves in 5 different colors, representing samples from several periods in history. The purple corresponds to the sample from the Shroud of Turin, and the green corresponds to a piece of fabric taken from an archaeological site in Masada, Israel. It's nearly 2,000 years old.
The sample from the Shroud of Turin has peaks and summits very similar to those of a sample taken from the ancient fortress of Masada, which confirms that the Shroud of Turin must be around 2,000 years old.
This recent study has gained support from many people who believe in the authenticity of the shroud, and it's been published on the most important Syndenology websites. The problem is that no one has proved the scientific validity of the study as of yet.
First, we have no idea where the sample came from. It was obtained by a private individual, but there's no traceability. Next, no one on the team is an expert on the dating of ancient objects. The last issue is the method. Essentially, they decided the best way to date the shroud accurately was to invent a whole new method of dating, which is absurd. On the contrary, the more controversial an object is, the more important it is to use a method that we've been using for years and that has been used on numerous other objects.
It's okay to say, look, we have a new technique. We're going to then make that available to the public with the hopes that other researchers that have access to the technology can then make an attempt to use it to see if this technique can actually be used for age dating. All of that has not had enough time for science to verify it. So any claims made for those techniques, sorry, I don't consider them valid, not yet.
So, was the Shroud of Turin really used to cover the body of Jesus Christ after he died on the cross? Or is it merely a painting done in the Middle Ages? The Church has always chosen to stay in the background, avoiding taking sides. For the Vatican, it doesn't matter whether the shroud is authentic or not. They don't need physical proof of Christ's resurrection to believe in it. So regardless of whether it's a sacred relic or the more likely option, a medieval counterfeit, all the years of controversy seem to have done nothing more than cement the legend of this unique object known as the Shroud of Turin.